You have watched 1,000 people try to change Donald Trump's mind about something. You have watched senators fail, generals fail, lawyers fail, and 4 different chiefs of staff fail. You are about to watch a 19-year-old succeed, quietly, without a title, without a press conference, without anyone in the building knowing it was happening until the results were already in. The thing nobody expected about the 2024 election was not the margin. It was the mechanism. By the morning after election night, the numbers were telling a story that political scientists had not modeled, pollsters had not predicted, and campaign professionals had not built for. Republican men between 18 and 29 had turned out in a configuration not seen in 40 years. The margin with that demographic had not just shifted, it had moved in a way that suggested something structural had changed in how that generation received a candidate, and specifically in how Donald Trump had reached them. By December 2024, 3 separate political analysis teams had traced the structural shift to the same origin point, a single podcast episode, the October 2024 appearance on Joe Rogan's show. 3 hours, unfiltered, the kind of media environment Trump had spent 40 years avoiding, had been streamed 47 million times. It was, by every available metric, the most listened to political interview in the documented history of recorded audio. And the person who had told Donald Trump to do it was not a campaign manager, not a pollster, not a communications director. It was his son. Barron Trump was 17 years old when he made the recommendation. Nobody in that room knew what it would become. The atmosphere inside the Mar-a-Lago family residence in the weeks before the Rogan conversation had the specific quality of a campaign that knows it needs something but cannot name what it is missing. The professional strategists had built a media plan around the outlets they understood. Fox, Newsmax, controlled interviews, friendly rooms. The plan was working in the base. It was not working with the demographic that the internal models had flagged as the variable the election would turn on. Young men, unattached to either party, consuming media in formats that the campaign's senior communications staff had never personally used. The gap between where those voters lived and where the campaign was speaking was not a messaging problem. It was a topographical one. 2 landscapes. No bridge. Barron saw the bridge. He did not present a memo. He did not schedule a meeting. He did not commission a study. He said, in the specific way that someone says something they have been observing long enough to be certain of, that his father needed to be on Joe Rogan's podcast. He said it the way a 19-year-old says something to a 78-year-old father who has run the most recognizable media operation in the world for 4 decades. Quietly, without performance, in the register of someone who is not seeking credit, only outcome. The professional strategists who heard the recommendation did not immediately recognize what they were hearing. They had the specific trained instinct of people who have spent careers measuring the reach of legacy platforms and had not yet recalibrated for the new ones. Trump heard it differently. He agreed to do the podcast the way he agrees to things that have been suggested by someone he trusts in a register he finds credible, without extensive deliberation, without an advisory meeting, without a formal sign-off chain. The logistics were arranged. The date was set. The episode was recorded. Then a door near the curtain of the campaign opened, and what came through it changed the entire archaeology of the 2024 election. The episode ran 3 hours and 7 minutes. Trump arrived at the recording space with the physical grammar of a man entering a room he is not certain he controls, which is a grammar almost nobody had seen from him in a public media setting in the preceding decade. He adjusted his jacket at the threshold. The slow, deliberate movement of a man calibrating himself to an unfamiliar environment, hands working the lapels, a brief pause at the cuffs, the micro-inventory of a person who is prepared but cannot be certain the preparation is sufficient. The chair he settled into was not the chair he had spent 40 years in. No desk between him and the interviewer, no stage lighting angled to flatten his edges, no floor director with a countdown he could read as a signal for when the real conversation ends and the performance begins. Just 2 chairs, 2 microphones, and a man who had been told by his son that this was where the election lived. Rogan asked the first question with the unhurried specificity of someone who has conducted 1,500 interviews and has learned that the most revealing ones begin in the most ordinary register. He said, "What do you actually think about young people right now? Not the political talking point. What do you actually think?" Trump was quiet for a beat longer than his media-trained rhythm usually permitted. The quiet had the particular texture of a man who has been asked a question that his standard architecture of answers does not immediately fit, and who is deciding, in real time, whether to reach for the architecture anyway or to answer without it. He answered without it. That choice, the unguarded, unfiltered 3-hour conversation that followed, was not something the campaign had engineered. It was something a 19-year-old had created the conditions for by understanding, with the specific digital fluency of someone who had grown up inside the media landscape that his father's generation was trying to map from the outside, that the audience Rogan commanded was not looking for a polished candidate. They were looking for a human being. And the only room in which Donald Trump had any realistic chance of being received as a human being rather than a political event was a room with no desk, no stage lighting, and no floor director. The clip of Trump laughing at a Rogan observation about government bureaucracy, unscripted, unfiltered, the laugh of someone who has temporarily forgotten to be a president and remembered to be a person, became the most shared political clip of October 2024. A man in his 40s who had not voted since 2012 later said in a publicly posted thread that the laugh was the thing. Not the policy positions, not the debate performance, not the ads. The laugh. The specific, undefended human sound of it, in a room that had been built for exactly that quality of reception. By election morning, the Rogan episode had been streamed 47 million times. The youth male turnout numbers that came in after midnight were not a polling anomaly. They were an outcome. The archaeology of that outcome, traced backward through the data, through the streaming numbers, through the demographic breakdowns that arrived in the weeks after the election, ran through the Rogan episode without exception. And the Rogan episode ran through a recommendation. And the recommendation came from a person who had never given a public speech, never held a campaign title, never appeared on a Sunday show, and was, at the time he made the recommendation, not yet old enough to vote. Political analysts who spent the months after the election excavating the 2024 demographic shift kept arriving at the same uncomfortable finding. The most consequential piece of strategic advice in the campaign had not come from a campaign. It had come from the family dinner table, from a 19-year-old who had watched the gap between his father's media strategy and the audience his father needed, had understood the gap with the clarity of someone who existed natively in the space between them, and had said the thing that nobody with a campaign salary had been willing to say. The voters you need are not watching what you're appearing on. Trump acknowledged it publicly in the weeks after the election, not in a formal statement, not in a policy context, but in the specific offhand register of a man describing something that happened as though it is unremarkable, which is the register in which the most remarkable things are always described. He said Barron had told him to do the podcast. He said it in passing. He moved on. The people who caught the sentence replayed it later with the specific attention of those who understand that the most significant decisions in powerful families are rarely made in rooms with titles on the door. By the time the analysis teams had finished their work and the political science journals had begun publishing preliminary findings on the youth vote shift, the archaeology was complete. Every line of it pointed in one direction. A 19-year-old in a room without cameras, without credit, without any structural authority in the campaign that was shaping the country's future, had looked at a gap that professionals with decades of experience had not closed, and had closed it with a single sentence. The archaeology is complete. What it shows is not a campaign victory. It is something quieter and considerably stranger. The specific, undocumented, unannounced influence of a young man who understood the room his father needed before his father did, and said so, and was heard. After everything you just heard, ask yourself one thing. What else has been hiding behind the noise? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story isn't over. It's just getting started.